And I think what we're seeing today is just a continuation of the market cycling, in this case, sort of into the negative territory if you're a shipper, more favorable territory if you're a service provider.
How do we and our shippers, how do we talk about or navigate that? Because many of them were looking for another reduction in cost that's just way past unattainable. Welcome back, everyone, to Stay in Your Lane. I'm your host today, John Maley, with Sam Looker. Special guest today. It's not very often I get time with him, but Paul Newbourne is here from Logistic Project Consulting. But Paul has a huge background. Paul, you've been with Armada, CSX, ConAgra, Excel, Covenant. You've been the president of Food Shippers of America. Joe, you're familiar with that role. You had that also. Joe Lombardo is with us today, our favorite podcast contributor. But the reason why I asked Paul to be on, and I think it's a huge value you bring to us, Paul, is navigating, the past 3.5 years of what we would call the Great Freight Recession, a pricing model moving forward to stability is the big term I think everybody's using now. So no longer is it clawback or driving out revenue. The focus is now on stability, because that's what we're seeing, the problem with stability throughout the market. So, Paul, I would love to hear your thoughts, because from what Sam and I see, many shippers are still shipping and looking for unsustainable numbers that they have been attaining in years past.
So just for the record, John, I actually was not the president of Food Shippers. I was the executive director. But I appreciate the promotion.
Finalities.
I would have made you the president. What about you, Joe? Would you have given him the title?
He's the grand guru of logistics. That's his title in my mind.
Right.
There you have it.
Yeah. So John, back to the topic at hand. This is certainly what I'll call a constant that I've seen throughout my career. You get market fluctuations, changes in supply, changes in demand, changes in cost inputs. And I think what we're seeing today is just a continuation of the market cycling, in this case, sort of into the negative territory if you're a shipper, more favorable territory if you're a service provider. And that's kind of how the business tends to run. It has the 40-some years that I've been in the industry. The challenge is, how do you want to manage through those ups and downs? And in my experience, I've seen a lot of that has to do with what is the company's sort of procurement strategy? Are you a transactional buyer, right, on what I'll call the left-hand side of the relationship spectrum? Or are you more partnership-oriented, which would be on the right side? Or are you somewhere in the middle, right? And it might be a balanced combination. You might have transactional relationships, you might have more partnership relationships. But to me, the further to the right of that spectrum that you are, the more likely you're going to be looking at your relationship on a longer term basis. And as a result, you're going to tend not to jump at the first sort of nickel a mile reduction, or if you're the carrier is going to try to stabilize their position, because they view you as a provider of their network. And it's that stability that benefits both parties. The shipper can rely on high levels of tender acceptance, good levels of service. The carrier is able to plan his network and position his equipment at the right place at the right time, and it works. The key to that is everyone has to be happy with the economics, right? If you're the shipper, you've got to have a rate that is manageable and will allow you to compete in your marketplace. If you're the carrier, it has to provide you with an adequate return to stay in business. And that's sort of catch-22, right? What is that balance? In my experience, that balance comes through conversation. And then it's a question of integrity. If I commit to you to do something, I need to do it, and vice versa. And there needs to be discussion up front about, well, what happens in the cycle, right? When the cycle's in the carrier's favor, Mr. Carrier, you have to promise that you're not going to run out and throw me into the lot with your transactional customers and raise my rates to ridiculous levels. By the same token, when it's in my favor, I need to commit that I'm not going to do the same thing to you and run around chasing the lowest rate in the marketplace. So in my experience, it's a balance, and it's a mix of relationships. You will need some transactional carriers, but you can run the bulk of your network with, I'll call them, more committed carriers, if you can work out what I'll call equitable arrangements that make both of you happy, right? You can meet your budget expectations as a shipper, and the carrier can continue to remain a going concern without having to chase the spot market. Questions so far?
Sam, this, I think what you said makes terrific sense, and thank you for explaining it in a, I would say, an intelligent delivery. I also believe that we're in different times than we've seen in the past. We've always seen ups and downs, to your point, in the market. My model's always been riding in the middle. Don't avoid both extremes, right? And build the relationship and stability and develop it. But I look at a business very much like, retirement. If I wouldn't do this with my retirement revenue, because I know I'm going to need it someday, I'm not gambling with it, I wouldn't do it with my business in the same respect. So I lean more towards the right from a business model perspective. We don't like, instability. We don't like, a lot of problems and repetitive carriers and regular guys and committed relationships. That's our business model. But I think what we've seen, I think COVID was so extreme that I don't necessarily know that we have seen a post-COVID type of scenario that we have the past 3.5 years at any other time in the past 30 plus years I've been in the industry. We've not seen the extremes this extreme. So I'm somewhat afraid that many of the shippers and carriers are far apart in a lot of instances. Rebecca Brewster shared with us that of all the years at ATRI tracking carrier profitability, 2025 was the first year it actually went negative on all miles. Meant that, the average was 2.3 or 2.4% or cents per mile negative. That was, not surprising data, but surprising that it's never happened before. So we've never seen the extreme lows that we're navigating now. And what always seemed to pull us out was a demand push, right? And when the economy picks up and volumes pick up and revenue picks up, we benefit from the demand push. But I don't know that across the whole industry we have the demand push that we see maybe in the industrial sector right now, where it hasn't made it full circle around to all of the other industries. So how do we and our shippers, how do we talk about or navigate that? Because many of them were looking for another reduction in cost that's just way past unattainable. And then now we have the extreme, because I think the spot market is more of a picture in people's minds in our industry today than it ever was before. I mean, there was always a spot market, but I think now it's a larger percentage of people's networks, and it's a bigger puzzle. So how do we navigate those extremes? And to your point, I don't know that it's changed a lot. Sam, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think the spot market thing's interesting, and it is becoming a big player right now. We have some customers where they'll come directly to us and say, hey, what do you need to get this done? I want to keep it off the spot board. I don't want to muddy the waters. And there's also other customers where we're seeing hundreds of loads daily on their spot board and things are just out of control. So there's the right shippers like you're talking about, Paul, and then there's the ones on the left. And, some are a combination of both. I'd say most are, but, we're in an interesting time because there's a lot of factors that are playing into what we're seeing, the increased fuel cost, the industrial boom. Volume is slightly up, but it's not crazy high. So when volume does go up, what's that going to do? It's just an interesting combination of variables right now.
Yeah, I think before, Joe Lombardo, you would jump in here. I think, for many years, Joe, we could look at 4 or 5 6 different factors and pretty much have a handle on what's going on in the market and where we were headed. And I think currently, it's not. I don't think that works. I think that the buyer in today's market, the consumer, has learned maybe some tough lessons and struggled through the post-COVID era here, and they're not going to just go right back out on that limb. What do you think, Joe?
Yeah, no, good points, John. I guess the thing I like to bring up, and Paul mentioned this in his opening remarks about the procurement, what is the company's procurement policy? I think there's 2 factors that have really increased in the last, I'd say 5 to 10 years, maybe even a little longer. And I'm talking from a shipper perspective. A lot of shippers now, you've got their corporate procurement group, their corporate purchasing group, working a lot closer or with the supply chain, with the transportation department. And again, procurement has their own strategy when it comes to a different strategy when it comes to buying services. In a pure procurement play, they look at the transportation market and they say, wait a minute, there's thousands and thousands of suppliers. No one has a huge market share. I can play this to my advantage. When again, we all know that most of those suppliers are small truck operators. So that's one thing that's been pushing on the larger shippers. The second factor is, I think, the more engagement, and I saw this at my last days at Nestle, of the finance group. Finance, they want to sit at the table. In fact, they want to be at the head of the table a lot of times, putting a lot of pressure on the supply chain transportation group, to lower costs. Again, because if you look in a large company, they've gone through most of their cost structure, and they say, well, we've cut here, we've got this big transportation budget out there. Let's focus on that. And again, you've got people that are not supply chain people that don't understand the shifting markets, trying to get in there and just, save money. I mean, I've heard places where the finance group would say in a down market, oh, why don't we put all our loads on the spot market? We'll save a bunch of money. So again, I think big shippers have those 2 pressures coming from above, along with the normal, the ups and downs of a market, like everybody has said previously.
Continue watching on the next episode of the Stay in Your Lane podcast.